When Grace Witherspoon found a scruffy, stray dog sleeping under her porch, she never imagined how much he would change her life. She named him Lucky, and in the months that followed, he proved to be more than just a companion. One fateful night, his bravery would save Grace in a way that left her in tears and revealed the incredible journey of a dog who found his purpose. Grace Witherspoon loved her mornings at home. Her house, surrounded by trees and quiet roads, was peaceful. She sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying the soft breeze. But then she heard it, a faint scratching sound from underneath the porch. She paused, tilting her head. Probably a raccoon, she thought aloud, brushing it off. Later that day, as she went outside to water her plants, something caught her eye. Tucked under the porch in the shade was a dog. It wasn't just resting. It was curled up tight, looking thin and dirty, its fur tangled with mud. Grace felt her heart sink. "Hey there," she said softly, kneeling down. The dog lifted its head, its eyes wide and cautious. It didn't move, just stared at her like it wasn't sure what to expect. Grace reached into her pocket, pulling out a small cracker she had left over. She broke it into pieces and held out her hand. "It's okay. I won't hurt you," she whispered. The dog sniffed the air but didn't come closer. After a few moments, it inched forward, its belly almost touching the ground. It grabbed the cracker quickly and backed away, chewing as it kept its eyes on her. Grace stayed still, watching it carefully. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she murmured. The dog didn't answer, of course, but its tired eyes said enough. Grace sighed, standing up. "All right," she said, heading inside. "Let's see if I can help you out." Grace carried a small bowl of water and a plate of leftover chicken back to the porch. The dog was still there, lying low but watching her closely. "Here you go, buddy," she said, placing the food and water just a few feet away. She stepped back, giving the dog space. At first, it didn't move. Its eyes flicked from Grace to the plate, its body tense. Slowly, it crawled forward, sniffing the food. "That's it," Grace encouraged softly, smiling as the dog finally began eating. It devoured the chicken in seconds and drank the water like it hadn't had a proper meal in days. Over the next hour, Grace worked to gain the dog's trust. She talked to it in a calm voice, moving slowly so she wouldn't scare it. Finally, she stood by her open door and called out, "Come on in, boy. It's safe in here." The dog hesitated. Its muddy paws stayed planted on the porch, and it looked at her like it wasn't sure what to do. Grace knelt down, holding out another piece of chicken. "It's okay," she said. "You'll be warm and fed inside." After what felt like forever, the dog stepped inside cautiously, its movements slow and deliberate. Grace closed the door behind them, trying not to make a sound. Once inside, the dog kept its distance, staying near the walls and watching Grace's every move. She didn't push it, letting it explore on its own. She laid out an old blanket in the corner of the living room and said, "This can be your spot." The dog sniffed the blanket but didn't lie down. Instead, it curled up under the dining table, its eyes half closed but still wary. Grace sat on the couch, pretending to read a book while keeping an eye on her new guest. She didn't know much about dogs, but one thing was clear, this one had been through a lot. The next morning, Grace woke up to find the dog lying on the blanket she'd set out. It looked up when she entered the room but didn't move away this time. "Well, good morning," Grace said with a smile. She brought over a bowl of kibble she picked up from the store earlier. The dog wagged its tail, just once, as it started eating. Grace's smile widened. "You're going to be all right," she said softly, sitting on the floor nearby. For the first time, the dog seemed to relax. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few days, the dog, now named Lucky, started settling into Grace's home. He was still cautious but followed her everywhere, staying close like a shadow. "You're getting the hang of this, huh?" Grace said one evening, watching Lucky curl up on his blanket by the fireplace. But there was one thing about Lucky that Grace couldn't ignore. He was always watching. Lucky had a habit of sitting by the front window, staring outside for hours. His ears perked up at every passing car, and sometimes he let out a low growl, though he never barked. At first, Grace thought it was normal dog behavior. But one evening, Lucky's growling became more frequent. Grace walked over to see what had his attention. "Something out there, boy?" she asked, peeking through the curtains. There was nothing unusual, just the quiet street and a car driving past. Still, Lucky's eyes didn't leave the driveway. The next morning, Grace found Lucky sitting by the window again. This time, his focus was on the gate at the end of the driveway. He was perfectly still, his ears pointed forward. "What are you looking at?" Grace asked, stepping closer. She followed his gaze but didn't see anything. Later, while taking out the trash, Grace noticed faint scuff marks near the gate. They hadn't been there the day before. She frowned, brushing it off. "Probably from the gardener," she muttered, though the thought left her uneasy. That night, Grace was jolted awake by Lucky growling at the front door. She quickly turned on the lights and rushed downstairs. Lucky stood stiffly, his eyes fixed on the door, growling low and steady. Grace's heart raced. She grabbed a flashlight and peeked outside. Nothing seemed out of place. The gate was closed, the driveway empty. "Come on, Lucky. There's nothing there," she said, trying to calm herself as much as him. But Lucky didn't relax. Even after she went back to bed, she could hear him pacing near the door, his nails clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The next morning, Grace tried to shake off the unease from the night before. Lucky seemed calmer but still sat by the window, his watchful eyes never leaving the driveway. "You've got me on edge, buddy," Grace said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Let's go for a walk. Maybe you'll relax." The neighborhood was cucks a bit. The streets lined with tall trees and well-kept lawns. Lucky stayed close to Grace, his leash taut as he sniffed every tree and bush along the way. But as they turned a corner, Lucky suddenly froze. His ears perked up, and his body went stiff. "What is it?" Grace asked, following his gaze. A man was standing near her mailbox, pretending to scroll through his phone. He wore a dark hoodie, the hood pulled up despite the warm morning sun. Lucky growled softly, his tail low. Grace tightened her grip on the leash, her heart quickening. The man glanced up, noticed her watching, and quickly walked away. "Strange," Grace muttered, pulling Lucky closer as they continued their walk. The encounter left Grace uneasy. Back home, she checked the mailbox, half expecting to find something out of place, but it was empty. Lucky, however, didn't relax. He resumed his spot by the window, his eyes glued to the street. "You're acting like a guard dog," Grace said, half joking. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. Later that evening, Grace noticed something odd. The garden gate, which she always kept latched, was slightly ajar. "I know I closed that," she muttered, stepping outside to inspect it. Lucky followed her, sniffing around the gate and growling softly. She looked closer and spotted faint footprints in the dirt, leading away from the gate toward the street. Grace's stomach turned. "Maybe it's just the gardener," she said aloud, trying to convince herself. But as she locked the gate and headed back inside, Lucky's behavior told her otherwise. He stayed near the door all night, his ears twitching at every sound. The next day, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The odd man in the hoodie, the strange behavior of the dog, and now the open gate with the faint footprints. It all felt too coincidental. She knew she had to get to the bottom of it, but she couldn't quite figure out what was pulling her in different directions. Was she simply being paranoid, or was there something deeper lurking just beneath the surface? Grace sat at her kitchen table, her mind spinning with questions. Was it possible that the man from yesterday had been watching her house? Was he connected to the open gate and the strange footprints? She couldn't be sure. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Lucky. The dog's instincts had always been spot on, and his behavior lately was more than just protective. It felt like he was trying to tell her something. "Why are you acting like this, Lucky?" Grace asked, rubbing his head as he sat by the door, still tense. He gave her a soft look, his eyes full of concern. She stood up and made her way over to the window. There was no sign of the strange man today, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone was still watching her. Grace's eyes swept the quiet street, looking for any signs of movement. Nothing out of the ordinary, but she knew she couldn't afford to ignore what had been happening. Later that afternoon, Grace decided to take a walk around the perimeter of her yard, hoping to find more clues. She retraced the steps by the garden gate, hoping that whatever footprints she had seen earlier would give her some insight into what had happened. Her mind buzzed with possibilities. Could it have been someone trying to break in? Maybe the stranger from yesterday had some ulterior motive. Lucky walked beside her, sniffing the ground as if he, too, was trying to solve the mystery. He stopped at a spot near the garden where the footprints had been. His nose twitched, and he let out a low growl, his body tense. Grace knelt down beside him, inspecting the dirt carefully. The faint marks were still there, but now she noticed something else, tiny, almost imperceptible threads caught in the fence's wire. "What's this?" she muttered to herself. She gently tugged at the threads, realizing they were too thin to be from clothing. They were strands of hair, fine, dark hair. A chill ran down Grace's spine. These were not just random footprints. They were signs that someone had been paying close attention to her house, possibly even waiting for the right moment to make a move. And now it seemed like that person had left a breadcrumb trail behind. Grace knew she had to gather more information, so she decided to visit her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who had lived on the block for years. If anyone knew what was going on in the neighborhood, it was her. The elderly woman greeted Grace at the door, a welcoming smile on her face. But as soon as Grace mentioned the strange man from the day before, Mrs. Peterson's expression changed. "Oh dear," she said, her voice trembling. "I've seen him. He's been hanging around here the last few days, always walking past your house, never saying a word to anyone. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think much of it. You know how it is these days. People are always in a hurry, coming and going. Grace's stomach turned. Do you know where he's from or what he was doing here? Mrs. Peterson shook her head. No, honey, I don't. But I've seen him leave in the early hours around the time you're usually getting up. He comes from down the street and disappears in the other direction when he leaves. That was strange. Grace had never seen anyone like him around here before. And if he was leaving before dawn, it only deepened the mystery. What was he doing? The connection. After her conversation with Mrs. Peterson, Grace decided to take one more look around the yard, feeling an increasing sense of urgency. Something didn't add up. Was this just a random person, or was he connected to something larger? The man in the hoodie wasn't just an intruder. He was part of a bigger puzzle, and Grace was determined to solve it. She stood by the garden gate again, her eyes scanning the area. Lucky sat quietly next to her, his eyes following her every move. There was a sense of unease in the air, the quiet of the street now feeling suffocating. The threads in the wire, the footprints, the strange man, everything pointed to something more than a simple neighborhood disturbance. Grace's phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her from her thoughts. She pulled it out, and her heart skipped when she saw the message from Sarah, her best friend. You need to come to the cafe. I found something. It's about your house. Grace didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and rushed to meet Sarah, Buddy at her side. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each more terrifying than the last. Was someone really watching her house? Was she in danger? And if so, why? As she arrived at the cafe, Sarah was already sitting at a table, a serious look on her face. She had a folder in front of her, and she motioned for Grace to sit down. I found something, Sarah said, her voice low. I did a bit of digging into your address, and there's more here than you realize. Grace's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Sarah opened the folder and slid a few papers across the table. I found a history of incidents tied to your house. Your place was once owned by someone, involved in a shady operation. There were records of people coming and going late at night, strange deliveries, and then the house was sold off a few years ago, quickly, with no records explaining why. Grace's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean, shady operation? I think you've unwittingly moved into a place that was used for something illegal. And that man you saw, I think he knows something about it. Grace's head spun as she absorbed the weight of Sarah's words. Her safe, quiet home, the one she had chosen to escape the noise of the world, was connected to something far darker than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't just a random encounter, it was personal. The man in the hoodie wasn't some stranger. He was connected to the very house she lived in. Do we tell the police? Grace asked, fear creeping into her voice. Sarah shook her head. We don't know enough, but we need to be careful. There's something more going on here, and it's not going to let you go easily. Grace felt the heaviness of the situation settle into her bones. The calm days she had once known were gone. Whatever was coming, she was ready to face it, head on, with Lucky by her side. In Chapter 5, Grace begins to unravel the mystery surrounding her home, discovering clues that lead her to believe someone has been watching her. With Sarah's help, Grace uncovers the dark history of her house and realizes she's connected to something far more dangerous than she initially thought. With Lucky's instincts guiding her, Grace knows that the real fight is only just beginning. The days following the intruder scare were tense. Grace tried to push the unease to the back of her mind, but Lucky's behavior wouldn't let her. He was more alert than ever, growling at the faintest sound and pacing near the doors and windows. You're starting to freak me out, buddy, Grace muttered one evening as Lucky growled softly at the back door. She double-checked the locks, her stomach knotting with an unfamiliar sense of paranoia. One night, Lucky's barking jolted Grace awake. She rushed downstairs, her heart pounding, only to find him standing by the front window. What is it this time? She whispered, peeking through the curtains. There was nothing out of the ordinary. A delivery truck parked across the street, its driver unloading boxes. It's just a delivery, Grace said, kneeling to pet Lucky. You've got to relax. Lucky's ears twitched, but he didn't take his eyes off the truck until it drove away. Later that week, Grace started receiving late-night calls. Each time she answered, the line would go silent. The first time, she dismissed it as a wrong number. By the third call, her unease grew. Probably some prank, she told herself, though her hands trembled as she set the phone down. Lucky, lying nearby, lifted his head and stared at the phone, his body tense. One afternoon, Grace ran into her neighbor, an older man named Mr. Carter, while walking Lucky. Everything all right, Grace? Mr. Carter asked, his tone concerned. Why do you ask? She replied, forcing a casual smile. There's been a van parked near your house a few nights this week. Didn't think much of it at first, but it hasn't been back since the other night. Just thought you should know. Grace's chest tightened. Thanks, Mr. Carter. I'll keep an eye out. That night, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She locked all the doors and windows, double-checking every latch. Lucky stationed himself by the front door, his growls low and steady. Grace lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of Lucky pacing. Whatever was coming, Lucky seemed to know it was close. Grace was jolted awake by a sound that sent a chill down her spine, glass shattering downstairs. For a moment, she lay frozen in bed, her heart racing. Then came the barking. Lucky's deep, furious barks echoed through the house. "Lucky," she called out, her voice trembling. Grace crept out of bed, grabbing her phone from the nightstand. She dialed 911 with shaking hands, but didn't press call yet. As she reached the top of the stairs, she peered into the dimly lit living room. There, in the shadows, was a man. He was wearing a ski mask, rifling through drawers and stuffing items into a bag. Grace's breath caught. She ducked behind the railing, clutching her phone tightly. Before she could react, Lucky appeared. He charged into the room, barking louder than Grace had ever heard. The intruder spun around, startled. Lucky lunged, grabbing the man's arm with his teeth. The bag dropped to the floor with a thud. The man yelled in pain, trying to shake Lucky off, but the dog held firm, growling fiercely. Grace forced herself to move. She hit the call button on her phone and whispered, "There's a break-in at my house. My dog has the intruder. Please hurry." The operator assured her help was on the way. Downstairs, the struggle continued. The intruder managed to shake Lucky off for a moment, but the dog quickly blocked his path, snapping at him when he tried to move toward the door. Panicked, the man kicked over a chair and bolted toward the shattered window. Lucky lunged again, narrowly missing his leg as the intruder climbed out and disappeared into the night. Grace ran downstairs, her heart pounding. Lucky stood by the broken window, his fur bristling, barking into the darkness. "Good boy," Grace said, wrapping her arms around him. "You're so brave." Lucky let out a low growl, his eyes still fixed on the yard, as if waiting for the man to come back. Within minutes, flashing lights filled the driveway. Officers swarmed the house, searching the yard and surrounding area for the intruder. Grace explained what had happened, her voice still shaky. Lucky stopped him. He didn't let him get away with anything. One officer knelt beside Lucky, giving him a pat on the head. "You've got a real hero here," he said with a smile. Grace nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what I would have done without him." The chaos from the break-in lingered as Grace tried to process what had just happened. Lucky sat by her side, his breathing steady but his body still tense, ears alert to every sound. The broken glass scattered across the living room floor was a sharp reminder of how close she had come to danger. As officers combed through the house, one of them approached Grace. "It looks like your dog stopped this guy from taking much," he said, holding up the bag the intruder had dropped. "He didn't get far." Grace looked at Lucky, who wagged his tail slightly but kept his eyes fixed on the shattered window. "He didn't just stop him," Grace said quietly. "He chased him off." The officer nodded. "We're seeing a rise in break-ins in this area, but this is the first time one ended like this. Your dog's instincts probably saved you." Even after the officers finished their inspection and the glass was cleaned up, Lucky remained restless. He paced near the door, occasionally sniffing the air and growling softly. Grace knelt beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "It's okay, boy." "They're gone now," she whispered. Lucky turned his head, looking at her with a calm but intense expression, as if trying to reassure her while staying on guard. The next morning, Grace received a call from Detective Harper, who had taken over the case. "We found some interesting clues near your property," Harper said. "It looks like this wasn't random. Your house was being watched." Grace felt her stomach twist. "What do you mean?" "Footprints near the gate and some items left behind suggest they'd been planning this for days," Harper explained. "And your dog? He might have been the only reason they didn't succeed." Grace glanced at Lucky, who was lying by the window, his head resting on his paws, but his ears twitching at every sound. That evening, Grace sat on the couch with Lucky curled up beside her. She scratched behind his ears, her voice soft. "You're not just a good boy, Lucky. You're my hero." Lucky let out a quiet huff, leaning into her touch. For the first time since the break-in, Grace felt a sense of safety. Not because the locks were stronger or the police had come, but because Lucky was by her side. The following morning, Grace sat on her porch with Lucky by her side. The peaceful countryside felt a little less serene after the break-in. Lucky, ever vigilant, stayed close to her, his sharp eyes scanning the yard. Grace was startled by the buzz of her phone. Detective Harper's name flashed on the screen. "We've identified the man who broke into your house," Harper said. "He's part of a group targeting high-profile homes in this area." Grace's chest tightened. "So they were after me specifically?" "It looks that way," Harper replied. "We found a list in his possession, and your name was on it. It's a good thing your dog acted when he did. Without him, this could have been much worse." Grace looked down at Lucky, her fingers brushing through his fur. He was calm but alert, as though he understood every word. That afternoon, Grace received a call from a local news outlet. Word of Lucky's brave actions had spread through the police report, and they wanted to feature him as a hero dog in their upcoming segment. Lucky deserves all the attention, Grace said, smiling as she glanced at him. He saved me. The reporter laughed. We'd love to come by tomorrow for an interview. People need to hear this story. That evening, as Grace scrolled through her phone, she found herself researching local shelters and rescue organizations. Lucky's journey from stray to savior had sparked something in her, a desire to help other dogs who might be waiting for their own second chance. She made a mental note to visit a shelter soon, her heart feeling lighter with the thought of giving back. Later that night, Grace sat on the couch with Lucky curled up beside her. The house was quiet, the tension from the past few days finally beginning to fade. She leaned down, pressing her forehead to Lucky's. You're more than just my dog, you know. You're family now. Lucky's tail thumped softly against the couch, his warm amber eyes meeting hers. Grace felt a tear slip down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from gratitude. The day after the break-in, Grace decided to take Lucky to the vet for a full checkup. After everything he'd been through, she wanted to ensure he was healthy and fit. At the clinic, Dr. Collins, the vet, greeted them with a warm smile. This is the famous Lucky, I assume, she said, crouching to pet him. Lucky wagged his tail but stayed close to Grace's side. He's a little shy, Grace said, but he's also the bravest dog I've ever met. Dr. Collins ran her hands carefully over Lucky, checking his teeth, paws, and coat. He's in great condition now, she said, nodding. You've taken good care of him. Grace smiled. I can't take all the credit. He's tough. Dr. Collins paused as her fingers brushed over Lucky's side. Did you know he has a scar here? Grace frowned. No, I didn't notice. What's it from? It's old, probably from years ago, Dr. Collins said, gently examining the faint line on Lucky's side. It looks like it could have been from an injury or maybe surgery. Dr. Collins continued her examination, observing Lucky's behavior. He's very responsive. Watch this. She raised her hand in a specific motion, and Lucky immediately sat, his body perfectly still. Grace's eyes widened. Wait, how did he? Dr. Collins smiled. This kind of response usually comes from professional training. It's common in police or service dogs. Grace stared at Lucky, her mind racing. You're saying he might have been a working dog. It's possible, Dr. Collins said. His instincts and the way he handles himself, it's not typical for most dogs. On the way home, Grace couldn't stop thinking about what Dr. Collins had said. If Lucky had been a working dog, what had happened to him? Why was he left to fend for himself under her porch? You've got quite the story, don't you, boy? Grace said, glancing at Lucky in the passenger seat. Lucky looked at her, his amber eyes calm but sharp. It was as if he was carrying secrets he couldn't share, yet Grace felt closer to him than ever. The days after Lucky's heroic stand were calmer, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the break-in. Detective Harper's words about her being a target lingered in her mind. Lucky stayed close, his watchful behavior never wavering. He seemed to sense that things weren't entirely over. Detective Harper stopped by Grace's home one afternoon, carrying a folder filled with papers and photos. We've made some progress, he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. The man who broke into your house wasn't working alone. He's part of a larger group targeting high-profile homes. Your name was on their list. Grace's stomach dropped. Why me? You're a public figure, Grace, Harper said. That makes you a target for people looking for an easy payday. But there's more. We found surveillance photos taken near your house in the intruder's possession. They'd been watching you for weeks. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced at Lucky, who sat by her feet, his ears twitching as if he understood the conversation. Your dog likely disrupted their plans early on, Harper continued. From what we can tell, they tried to break in before but were scared off by his vigilance. Grace looked down at Lucky, her heart swelling with pride. He knew before I did, she said softly. Harper nodded. It's rare to see a dog this in tune with his surroundings. He's special, Grace. He saved you in more ways than one. Before leaving, Harper offered a final piece of advice. We're still investigating this group, but I'd suggest staying alert. It's possible others could be watching. Grace nodded, her resolve hardening. I'll make sure we're ready for anything. That night, Grace sat on the floor with Lucky, brushing his fur and speaking softly to him. You've done so much for me, boy. I promise to keep you safe, too. Lucky leaned into her touch, his tail wagging slightly. It was a quiet moment, but one that deepened their bond even further. Grace knew one thing for sure. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she and Lucky would face them together. The story of Lucky's bravery had spread quickly. Within days, Grace began receiving calls and messages from local news outlets, animal shelters, and fans who wanted to hear more about her incredible dog. Lucky, however, didn't seem fazed by the attention. He remained the same loyal companion, always by Grace's side, as though guarding her from threats only he could sense. One weekend, Grace decided to visit the local animal shelter. Lucky's journey from stray to savior had inspired her to give back. As she walked through the shelter, she saw rows of hopeful eyes staring out from behind metal gates. Some dogs wagged their tails, while others stayed curled up, nervous and unsure. A shelter worker approached her. "It's amazing what Lucky did," she said, smiling. "We've had a surge in adoption interest since his story aired." Grace looked at Lucky, who was calmly sitting at her feet. "I want to help," she said. "Whatever you need, funding, promotion, I'm in." The shelter decided to create a new program in Lucky's honor. It would focus on training rescued dogs, preparing them for roles in protection, companionship, or even therapy. "We'll call it Lucky's Second Chance Program," the shelter worker said, "because every dog deserves one." Grace felt her heart swell with pride as she watched Lucky interact with the shelter dogs, his calm presence helping the nervous ones relax. Over the next few weeks, Grace became an active supporter of the shelter, using her platform to promote adoption and raise awareness about the challenges stray animals face. "Lucky didn't just save me," Grace said during an interview. "He showed me the power of second chances, for him and for me." Months passed, and life for Grace and Lucky settled into a peaceful rhythm. The house felt warmer, safer, with Lucky by her side. The fear that had gripped her after the break-in was now a distant memory, replaced by gratitude and love for the dog who had transformed her world. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace sat on her porch with Lucky curled up at her feet. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was cool and still. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" Grace said softly, stroking Lucky's fur. His amber eyes looked up at her, calm and full of trust. She thought back to the day she found him, thin, dirty, and scared under her porch. Now he was strong, confident, and the center of her life. Grace sighed, a bittersweet smile crossing her face. "You didn't just save me that night," she whispered. "You gave me something I didn't even know I needed." Lucky wagged his tail as if he understood. The quiet moment stretched on, filled with a sense of peace that Grace hadn't felt in years. She knew her life had changed forever, not just because of what Lucky had done, but because of what he had brought into her world. Grace leaned closer, pressing her forehead gently to Lucky's. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together, okay? You and me forever." Lucky gave a soft huff, his tail thumping against the porch. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Grace sat back and looked out at the world beyond her yard. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful, not just for herself, but for the second chances waiting for every stray dog like Lucky.